everybody, and welcome to IDK, the Identity Knowledge Podcast, episode 01. Yet another technology podcast, ? I'm your host, Dave. So good to see you guys again. I've been really excited to come out and make the second episode. I've done the first episode. I really had a lot of fun working on it, and I've got a couple of other people that saw the episode before you guys got to it and have given me some great feedback. So I'm looking forward to doing this episode with you. And as I did last time, I kind of wanted to start by saying what was the reason for naming this particular episode Yet Another Technology Podcast ? Well, that's because I wanted to distinguish about what my podcast will be for. There are a lot of technologies in the identity and access management field, from technology vendors for identity governance to SSO and MFA to privileged access management. There's a bunch of different things that are part of that bubble of identity and access management. I can't spend enough time on these episodes to go through each of those pieces individually. And I also wanted this to be a very vendor neutral podcast. So when I say, will this be another technology podcast? Yes and no. There will be some discussion in our podcast about technology. That's just natural because we work in a field that is technology driven. That's not going to change. However, I refuse to draw any lines in the sand about a particular technology or try to defend a particular one over another one. Instead, I'd like for us to think of the good and bad things we can do with the technologies that we are able to access. And that's kind of what I wanted to set the stage for with this particular episode. So there will be some technology discussions throughout this podcast, and this is going to be one of them, but it's not going to be quite what you expect because I don't want to talk about all of these things that are related to a particular vendor and all that. So I'll hit a couple of basics first. You have an identity and access management platform, an IAM platform. This is your most standard thing. This is what does the pushing and pulling of information from one system to another. It's usually used to create provisioning of accounts, which is where you create your users and things. It's used to create roles wherein you're able to say, if you are of this particular role, you have these following permissions, things like that. These are parts of an identity and access management system. Then you get into the identity governance piece, and this is more of the security side of it. And this is where we look at what does a user have access to? Should they have access to that? And different ways to check and determine what the value of that access actually means. There's a discussion about the employee who goes from mailroom to CEO. And what that means is in companies, it's not as common nowadays, but there are still cases where you may have someone who started out at a very low-level position within the company, be it a mailroom clerk or janitor or whatever it may be, and they end up over years becoming a chief executive within that organization, be it a chief financial officer, chief executive officer, etc. These happen in the space frequently, and what often happens is a person will start out getting very basic permissions that were required to do whatever that job was, but as they go up through that chain, they continue to have more powers, more capabilities. They retain some of the powers that they had previously, and that can be dangerous. And that's kind of a piece of that concern with identity governance, and that's what it's supposed to do. So an identity governance tool will allow us to be able to check what a user has access to determine if it's good for them to do that access or not. It allows us to do user access reviews where we check within a specific period of time, here is what that person had access to, should they still have access, should they not, etc. That's another part of that. Then you have the SSO, MFA, front-end type tools. These can be your pings, your Oktas, and Microsoft in some cases. These are a front end that is used to authenticate once to many. If you know about the database relationships, a one-to-many relationship. So an SSO MFA type tool will have a single point of entry, and then it will spread that login information across many different applications within the company. Now, granted, these usually have to be web-driven or have some other piece that connects to them to grant access to that. But it's really great so you don't have to go into a bunch of different tools and constantly put in new usernames and passwords and all those kinds of things. They're very useful to have that. That's another part of the technology stack in the identity space. And then we look at a few more unique areas of the identity space, such as privileged access management, or PAM, as you might have heard. PAM is a bit of a different animal. So it is a technology used to manage people with high-level access within your environment. This could be a person who has a desktop administrator credential. This could be someone who has a high-level permission in a web interface that allows them to do something very big, say someone who has a lot of AWS permissions. It could be access to servers. Does this person, do you have an organization where you log into a server with the same username and password that you use to log into your laptop or your desktop? Because these permissions and these capabilities can really be dangerous in the wrong hands. And so a privileged access management tool is designed to help with that. And there's obviously some of the well-known ones. There's Delinea, also known as Thycotic. There is CyberArk. There are some other tools in that space, but those are the big names. And a PAM tool, again, is designed to work on that piece for privileged users. That's the standard stack that comes inside of an identity space, but there are a lot more pieces of technology in that space than just those items. Couple of things to consider. Logging. This is something that I really think is important, and it's also an area where we as identity professionals need to be good shepherds of the data we're given access to. So identity systems, by their nature, log access to things. So as a person comes into an organization, you'll probably have some sort of record that it shows that they got access to a thing, they were given an email address, they were given access to these applications, etc. That starts that process. And then once a person gets, say, a privilege credential, if you have a good working privilege system, then whenever someone uses their privilege permissions, you should have some sort of note, even if it's just a log entry that says, hey, Dave used his admin credentials to do a particular task on a particular device. This isn't necessarily to micromanage our users or anything of that sort, but it's more of a way to help maintain that security level that is needed for those users. So I'm okay with my organization giving me the ability to log in with a separate credential for the purpose of doing high-level administrative things. I'm fine with this because I don't see a reason why. I'm not doing anything wrong. And these high-level accounts are very easily taken over. So having the ability to log that data out of a PAM tool is very important. But there's more to it than that. I wanted to share an interesting story, and this is not my Q&A, but it's something that I had that's a neat little story. I can't provide too much information because I didn't get permission to provide it, but let's just say if you go look at my curriculum vitae, you'll see it as a link that you can check out. But at one point I was working for a large institution, a large educational institution, and in this large educational institution, we were using a ping front end for SSO MFA. It was something we wanted to make available. It was something that was going to make it easier to log into a variety of systems. It wasn't too long after the organization had started using Canvas as opposed to Blackboard. If you aren't from the educational space, that may not make sense to you, but these are just tools that allow you to access educational systems. So in this organization, we were launching Ping, and we were putting a bunch of new applications behind Ping each day to make it where they could do it, MFA and SSO. So if they logged into their front end of that university's websites, it would pass that authentication out to all these other applications. And I looked at the data that was available in here, and it was really interesting because when you look in an SSO tool data, you can see the authentication cycles, you can see the number of times a person logged into an application, you can see how long they spent on that application, and a few other things. And so the student engagement team came to us and they said, hey, we want to ask you this question. We're trying to build as high of a retention rate of our students as we possibly can. We know that there are students who are suffering maybe silently. There are students who are not interacting with their classmates. Students who may come to the university and they don't really know how to maintain their life. And so they're worried that these students were kind of falling by the wayside. And if you think about it, it's not that odd of an idea, because whenever if you're a freshman at a university, you're going to be very, unaware of certain things. At least many people will be, because it's the first time you might have been away from your parents. If you are an international student, it may be the first time you've ever left your home country. There's a lot of things that go on in that sort of time frame. And so it makes sense that there might be some people who start school and then they just realize it wasn't what they wanted, or maybe they want to do good in school, but they just can't. They just can't keep up with everything. And so they kind of start to shut down mentally. And so they said, we really want to find ways to engage with these students. Do you, IT team, have anything that could help us with that? So we looked at all of the different applications and different things that we had available, and we said, you know what, there is something we can do with that. So what we did is we used the ping system that we had, because when a user were to log into their Canvas system, they have to authenticate through Ping. There was no other way to get to that system. So the Ping tool would authenticate them to Canvas. And I said, you know what? We can do that, actually. We can log that information. we can see the number of times that a particular student accesses their Canvas system. We can see the number of times that a student logs out. We can see the amount of time a student spends in their Canvas system. And they said, is there any way we could get this data? Is there any way that that's possible? And this was an interesting moral conundrum because there's a thin line between engagement, protection, and being Big Brother. But this is a line that we as identity professionals have to be aware that we're going to have to be mindful of because we may be asked to cross it from time to time. So I thought about this and I said, okay, how can we approach this? And I said, here's what we'll do. If you guys give us a few indicators of the potential that a student may be not engaging with the university, students that are at high risk of losing any kind of access to the university because of their choices. Give us some of those things. We'll see what we can come up with. Well, thankfully, the student engagement team had already been looking at this. So they've been asking students via surveys. They've been asking teachers if they had seen certain numbers of students. They were getting permissions to go and look at occasional attendance logs. And so they said, yeah, we have some idea about that. And it was a really interesting partnership because we were able to go out to our identity platform piece, the SSO piece. We were able to put in to a log system these algorithms that would say if a student has not logged into Canvas for more than 7 days, trigger that. If the student has logged into Canvas but then instantly logs out and they've done this more than 10 times in a single week, trigger that. If a student is logging into their Canvas and staying on it for 12 hours, let's log that. And that was a little bit of a noisier one, but it was useful for a few reasons. So we put these filters in. And sure enough, after a little time, we were actually able to, without being creepy, we were able to provide log data that showed the users and the amount of times they were using these applications. And we were able to actually trigger very good safeguards for these people. We were able to do many cool things to help these students who were struggling. They would get connected to groups within the university that could help them achieve more. They would get put into groups of peers that might need some additional services. They were able to be talked to by their teachers about like, hey, I noticed, according to records, you haven't done your work in about a week. Is everything okay? Can I help you? Is there work that you need help with, etc.? And as someone who's also been an instructor in a university as well, this was a good idea because these students might not have realized they needed to ask for help, or maybe they were too ashamed to ask for that help, but they really needed it. And we could offer that to them. And this was a really unique usage of identity in that space. So instead, I would just encourage you to look at your identity system holistically. Think about the amount of data that we collect within our identity platform. And think about what are some ways that we could use that data to help improve, help to make the users have a better experience, help to make sure our identity systems are more secure in the long run. What does that look like and how do we do that? And that's what I want us to think about when we're thinking about the technology space. Because when it comes down to it, our technology, yes, it's a security, it's a login technology, but it's also a source of a lot of user information. And this is another topic that I kind of think is important is what is the line? Where is the line in the sand about what is reasonable for us to do with identity information and providing to, our employers versus what is kind of not? There's fears of Big Brother, fears of being monitored in ways that we didn't ever agree to being monitored. So we as professionals in the identity space have to be willing to draw that line. We have to be willing to stand up and say, okay, I do have this technology available. And yes, there are certain capabilities we could do to that. And we could take this information. I could probably provide it to you, but where is that line? So we have to be very careful how we safeguard our data, and not just from bad actors, not just from criminals that may want to get access to our identity data, but from the people who we work for too. Say if you're working for a large social network or you're working for some other place that has a lot of personal information about what people are doing, it's kind of dangerous to even start talking about what data I can share and what data I can't share. So from a technology perspective, yes, we can provide these pieces of data in ways that make sense. For instance, in the case of the university, it was a good idea because we were able to take this information and help find students who were in need and who maybe needed a little leg up to help them get better at what they were doing. But then we also had people who could have used that for stalking purposes. And there's some modicum of privacy that we give up by working in a field of connected devices, but that doesn't mean that we should provide that data willingly to everybody. So from a technology identity approach, I encourage you guys to think very long and hard about what technology we use in the identity space and what kind of things we should be doing to better manage that, to better supply that information, because it's not as easy to filter out what a user might be doing within their identity data. We have a lot that we could do with that. Don't be evil. And that's something I think I want to encourage throughout this podcast, is don't be evil if you're an identity professional. There are plenty of things that could be frustrating. You could probably have some things where like, oh, if the management had just done this or just listened this way, it would have been better. And that may be true. I'm not saying it isn't. But the thing is if you have the ability to connect to these technologies and do these things, you should still use them with an amount of caution. All right. So I think that's about where I'll end it up for today's episode of the podcast. I want to close out our podcast with a Q&A. And again, this podcast has not been made public yet, so I wanted to come up with another question that gets asked quite frequently by people I mentor in the identity space. And that is, what kind of education and what kind of learning should I do to be part of the identity field? And this is a really hard question because there isn't exactly like an identity management program that you can enroll in at a university. There are certain vendor-specific things that you can do. That is a real thing. But those, again, can be vendor-specific. So what can we do to show our knowledge in identity management without kind of crossing the line? And what I've come up with is a couple of examples. So first and foremost, I hold what is called a Certified Identity and Access Manager, or CIAM. This is a certification that is administered by the Identity Management Institute, the IMI, and it was the first of an identity certification I've ever found, and it was designed to be vendor neutral, and it was designed to cover what are some very basic concepts that a person who is responsible for managing identities should know. And it's a great certification. I highly recommend that you go out and take a look at it. I'm not getting paid by the IMI to provide you this information. However, I can tell you that if you go look at it, they've added a lot of new identity certifications to their school, but there's a lot of great material there. Another thing that you might want to think about when considering education-wise is identity management at its core is still a security function, or at least it should be. So Security Plus, the CompTIA certification, is another really important one. It kind of gets a bad rap because it's kind of a very basic certification. It's kind of like, anyone can get that. Well, that's great. But not everyone needs to be in this field, and not everyone is going to put that effort forth. So Security Plus is good because it gives you a very broad overview of the security world, and there are pieces about identity management within that certification program. So when you're thinking about certifications and things, consider the Security Plus as well. Beyond that, there are some other ones that are kind of making some waves. I don't have them directly in front of me right now, but there are a few others that are out there. Maybe I'll talk about them more in future stories. But for now, those are some good examples of what you should consider for at least getting started, because there's really no field that you can get enrolled in. Although I will tell you that being able to have experience with systems administration, having experience with coding of certain practices, being able to look at SCIM data and looking at SAML information, which is Security Authentication Markup Language, these are things that you should be very familiar with because you're going to use them a lot in your field. So anyway, that's a good Q&A question. I really would like to get some Q&A from you guys. And now that you guys know there's a Discord, there's even a particular chat channel in that Discord that will let you go and say, hey, here's something I'd like to have as a Q&A. So you can use that if you don't want to use the website forum. But you're encouraged to go out there and take a look at that. And again, if you've forgotten, that website is https IDK Podcast.tech, TECH. So go ahead, take a look at that, check out the website, and connect up with me on social media. That's it for this episode. It was great talking to you guys. This is the end of the Identity Knowledge Podcast today because now you know. We'll see you guys later.